opens eyes. Do you believe in a God that tells you lies, or do you believe in me? Do you believe in a God that brings you down? Do you believe in a God that wears the crown? Do you believe in a God that makes you bow, or do you believe in me? Do you believe in a God that satisfies? Do you believe in a God that opens eyes? Do you believe in a God that tells you lies, or do you believe in me? Do you believe in a God that brings you down? Do you believe in a God that wears the crown? Do you believe in a God that makes you bow, or do you believe in me?
It's Beyond Common Sense. It's Lanny Sense with Lanny Swerdlow, KCAA's resident gay, woke, liberal, pot-smoking, race-mixing, tree-hugging, left-handed, science-affirming, Jewish, humanist atheist, a white evangelical Christian nationalist worst nightmare. Hey, welcome to tonight's show. Lanny Sense. Well, we've got a lot of sense on this show because our guest tonight is Dr. Donald Prothero. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. We'll learn when he gets on the air, who's going to talking all about science denial and the dangers that it portrays to us. And he's going to get some really interesting history for us. So stick around for that. But first, right now, I want to make a quick announcement. You know, a very special day is coming up. That's April 20th. That's 420 Day. That is an international day of celebration. And it's a wonderful celebration because it's not based on nationalism. It's not based on religion. It's not based on some memorial, some dead person. It's a celebration of cannabis. And do you have a place to go? Well, if you live here in the Inland Empire, there is a celebration going on up in Joshua Tree. You know, Joshua Tree, the town that's a gateway to Joshua Tree National Park. It's going to take place this Saturday, April 20th, at the Beatnik Lounge, the legendary Beatnik Lounge at 61597 Highway 62. And it all begins at 3:30 with a welcome by host and convener Sunny Sundowner. At 4 p.m., I'm going to be making a presentation on the history of 420 Day and the celebration of cannabis consumption. And at 4:20, we're going to have a celebration with a drum circle, the Pulse of the Jungle. Then at 5 o'clock, live music for the rest of the day up to about 8 o'clock at night with Sunny Downer, the MSJ Band, Alex Mirage Burden and the MSJ Band, Too Much Nature, and Killer Sheep. That's going to be this Saturday, April 20th, 420 Day celebration at the legendary Beatnik Lounge, 61597 Highway 62 in beautiful downtown Joshua Tree. Okay, now we have another special guest on the line right now who's going to take a few minutes to talk about a special event coming up. It's David Diskin, president of the California Free Thought Day, a nonprofit organization based out of Sacramento, whose annual event is focused on, among other things, the separation of church and state, which is, we should all be focused on the separation of church and state, let me tell you. Today, he's here to talk about, however, Secular Advocacy Day, the Project of California Free Thought Day. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
We're so glad to have you on here. You know, I just learned about your organization a couple of weeks ago, and I am fascinated about it. Tell us about Secular Advocacy Day.
Yeah, thanks. It's one of our annual programs, and essentially it gives the secular community throughout California a chance to connect with our lawmakers. You know, civic engagement is one of our core values, and you know, among science, literacy, and social justice, and the separation of church and state and secular rights, we want to help people connect with the people who are making laws for everybody here in California. And so every year, right around April, we hold this Secular Advocacy Day. A lot of organizations do something similar to this, where they want the average person essentially to lobby to the people who they voted for or didn't vote for, and help them understand how certain bills are important or how we don't want to see certain bills get passed. And we see the Catholic Church doing this, we see Planned Parenthood doing this, and so we figured, you know, the secular community ought to be doing this as well. And every year we go through, pick a couple bills, and encourage everybody to join us and advocate.
That is so important. You know, we are totally ignored by most politicians, and that's because we don't contact them. So what you are doing is absolutely the most important thing we can do, because when a citizen contacts their state legislature, actually makes a phone call, or even better, makes it, visits them, that is the most powerful message out there. They pay more attention. They say it's 6 times more powerful when a constituent contacts their legislature than a paid lobbyist. So what you're doing is so important. So what bills are you going to be pushing for?
Well, there's 3 that are on the top of our list that we're going to be telling everybody about on Monday morning. One of them is Assembly Bill 2924. And keep in mind, these are all state bills. They're not federal. So 2924, this is kind of shocking to me. California is still one of the few states that allows minors to get married, children under 18, as long as they have some kind of court order or parental guardian consent. And most states have outlawed this completely outright, but in California, you can still be permitted to marry somebody double your age. You could be 14, 15. It could be somebody who got you pregnant. It could be something in a religious relationship. And so AB 2924 will completely prohibit underage marriage. We would love to see that get passed. There's 2 others that are on our list, in our primary list. One is Assembly Bill 798, and there's already laws in California that prohibit female genital mutilation, but that particular law, or this bill that we'd like to see, 798, strengthens the penalties for anyone who performs these acts. The third one is Assembly Bill 2339, and we all know how difficult it is to get in touch with your doctor, get in touch with your medical professionals. And some of us, especially during COVID, we saw how some medical places were opening up the option to do like Zoom meetings with your doctor, your physician, and so on. But it was still very challenging. It didn't apply necessarily to as many people, but with Medi-Cal especially, anyone who's being served by Medi-Cal, there are so many exclusions, requirements, limitations on how people can connect with their doctors. And so if 2339 passes, that will make it easier for healthcare providers to connect with their patients through video calls, phone calls, any other kind of digital methods, which, I think we can all agree that we need to make some big changes to healthcare, and this is a great way to do it.
It sure is. Now, this is all online. You don't have to be in Sacramento for this. Is that correct?
That's right. It's a statewide effort. And so anybody can join us because the entire thing is through Zoom. We're going to start on Monday morning. That's this coming Monday, the 22nd. And we spend about 45 minutes welcoming everybody through Zoom, just explaining the bills a little bit in more detail. We even do like a little role play. And then later on that afternoon, we will have appointments set up with the attendees' lawmakers or their staff. And so, for example, if Donald or if you wanted to sign up, we would find out who your legislator is, set up an appointment for Monday morning as well. You'd come to our thing first, get all the training, and then take a little 10, 15-minute break. And then in that same Zoom call, pops up your legislator ready to listen to what you want to say. And when we get people from the same area, let's say you get 2 people from Orange County, for example, we'll make sure that you're on the same appointment. So you're not alone. You're working there with other people that share these same views, talking to that same legislator.
Wow, this is really, so chances are, though, you won't be talking to your legislator. You'll be talking to a legislative aide, but that's okay. Legislative aides have a lot of influence on the legislators. They really do. So don't think you're wasting your time talking to a legislative aide. You are not. You are not.
Right.
So this is really good. So how do people sign up? Where can they go to sign up for this event?
All they have to remember is freethoughtday.org. They can just go there on their phone, their tablet, their PC right now, later on, freethoughtday.org, and just look for the button that says Advocacy Day. Now, I do have to tell everybody that the deadline for registration is tomorrow night. That's Wednesday night, because it takes us time to set up the appointments. They could still come to the Zoom meeting and learn about it, but we won't have any appointments set up for them unless they register by Wednesday, tomorrow evening.
Okay. Well, David, thank you so much for coming on here and for what you're doing. I'm going to sign up tomorrow because that sounds like something that really, really is important. I encourage all my listeners, all our listeners here, to go to freethoughtadvocacyday.com. Is that right?
Almost. Free Thought Day.
Free Thought
No
Day.
advocacy. freethoughtday.org.
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 I was close,
Yeah.
but not close enough. freethoughtday.org. Well, David, thank you so much. David is going to be a guest on our show on Tuesday, June 4th. So put that on your calendar. He's going to come back and he's going to talk all about what the organization is doing. And actually, they do have a day when everybody actually goes to Sacramento. So it's going to be an interesting day. So put that on your calendar, Tuesday, June 4th, for a special show with David Diskin. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. You guys have a great night.
Yeah.
Thank you again for letting us be here.
It's our pleasure. Bye-bye. Wow, I can't begin to underemphasize, whatever, how important it is that people who are secular, who are atheists, who are agnostic, who have to contact their legislators, because if they don't hear from you, they're going to assume that everybody is religious. So there's nothing more important than doing something like this. And if I've done it before, where I've gone to my this is really something what David's doing, though, that you're going to be able to meet your legislators online. You don't have to drive up to Sacramento or go to their offices near where you live. So this is cool. I'm going to be in part of this. Please join me for freethoughtday.org. Check it out. Okay, well, now to get to our really special guest. I was at a meeting of, I believe it was Inland Empire, a Riverside Atheist organization. They held it at the Spaghetti Factory. It was kind of supposed to be on Charles Darwin Day, but unfortunately some things come up, so they wound up holding it a couple weeks later. But Charles Darwin Day should be a national celebration. It should be an international celebration, because Charles Darwin came up, of course, with evolution by natural selection, and that is the basis of all biological sciences. And the speaker there was, and I'm going to mispronounce his name, so when he comes on, he can tell us what it's supposed to be, but it's Dr. Donald Prothero. And Dr. Donald, I'll say just Dr. Donald, is taught college geology and paleontology for 35 years at Caltech, Columbia and Occidental, Knox, Vassar, and Glendale, Mount San Antonio, and Pierce colleges. He earned his BA in geology and biology from, the University of California at Riverside, right here. He's one of us. And in 1976, he got his MA in 1978, his Master in Philosophy in 1979, and his PhD in 1982 in the Geological Sciences from Columbia University. He is the author of over 40 books and over 300 scientific papers, mostly on the evolution of fossil mammals, especially rhinos, camels, and horses. And they're the important ones, right? And on using the Earth's magnetic field changes to date fossil-bearing strata. That's over my head. He has been on the editorial boards of journals such as Geology, Paleontology, Journal of Paleontology, and Skeptic Magazine. He has received numerous awards, including in 2016 the Friend of Darwin Award from the National Center for Science Education. He has been featured on numerous TV documentaries, including Paleo World, Walking with Prehistoric Beasts, Prehistoric Monsters Revealed, Master Quest, Prehistoric Predators, Entelodon and Hydrodon, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, and Conspiracy Road Trip, Creationism, as well as on Jeopardy and Win Ben Stein's Money. We'll have to learn how much money he won from Ben Stein. Welcome to the show, Dr. Donald. How do you pronounce your last name, sir?
It's pronounced Prothero.
Prothero.
It's Welsh.
You told me that before, and I didn't remember it. Dr. Donald Prothero.
Okay.
Well, thank you for
Nobody ever learns it right. I'm used to always having to correct people. So.
Well, thank you for taking the time to join us on the show. I was so impressed by the presentation you made at the Riverside Atheist meeting on science denialism, and so I'm thrilled that you're here, because science denialism and is becoming a big thing, and in the 21st century, that's absolutely amazing. You know, when I meet some people, these crazy Christians that come to my door and knock on my door and want to preach Jesus to me, I tell them, I said, listen, I have a little challenge for you. I said, listen, I want you to go one day without religion. One day without religion. You know, don't pray, don't say anything to God, and see how you manage going one day without religion. Then I want you to try to go 1 hour without science. And don't flush your toilets, don't start your car, don't touch your medicine. And you can't. It's very easy to do without religion, but it's next to impossible to do without science, because science is so important. So, I like to talk with you about what our subject here, and so I got a couple questions for you. And
Sure.
And the first thing is. Science nihilism is nothing new. It's quite a history all the way back to the church silencing Galileo for his support on heliocentrism, which is the astronomical model in which the Earth and the planets revolve around the sun. And of course, the Catholic Church was saying, oh no, it's just the other way around. The sun revolves around us. Could you enlighten us on the history of science denialism and these weird things in the past of science that just flew in the face of what science was teaching us?
Yeah, I mean, it's a relatively recent thing, actually, that science has been taken seriously as a model for our culture and as a sort of touch point for reality, right? This culture was religiously dogmatic for thousands of years, and even during the Enlightenment, there was relatively little in the way of non-religious thinking going on, and it really wasn't until really pretty much started the 20th century and the Industrial Revolution that scientific and engineering breakthroughs, one after another, began to make science and engineering much more influential in human society. And certainly, primarily in the beginning of the 20th century, when a lot of various discoveries are made, especially in medicine, that transformed itself in the early 20th century and actually became effective in saving people's lives and preventing infant mortality and all the rest. Those are all things that gradually shifted the balance, so people began to recognize the importance of science, and so the culture shifts, and then other things happen. The shock of World War I and World War II sort of drove a lot of people away from religion at the same time. To watch the Holocaust or watch the massacres in World War I, a lot of people lost their faith in religion, and science was still working fine, although, of course, science was used for evil purposes in War II, as it can be. But it's a gradual 20th century phenomenon primarily, and certainly by the post-World War II period, where science brought us so many things, including the atomic bomb, which ended World War II. People recognized the importance of science. It wasn't until, of course, Sputnik in 1957 that we had a really sharp jolt in this country, recognizing that we were still behind in science in many areas. And so there was a huge push right after Sputnik to upgrade our science education, including putting evolution back in the classrooms, which had been pretty much wiped out after the Scopes trial. And so pretty much since the 60s, technology, science, engineering have all had very high places in our culture. And really, it's only very recently that we've seen it start to erode its position. I don't know, maybe 10 years ago even, if you had a poll of who are the most trusted individuals, scientists, teachers, doctors were always near the top of that list. But it's changing now. We find scientists are not trusted as much as they used to be.
And that is not a good thing. And I think part of the problem is that people don't understand science. They don't understand why it works. Could you kind of talk about why science works, and maybe especially talk about the scientific method? And that's the key, the scientific method.
Right. Yeah, the scientific method, of course, is presented in high school and others' textbooks in a very sort of cardboard fashion. Put up a hypothesis, try to explain things. Test your hypothesis, get a result. It's a little more complicated than that. It often has a lot of intuition involved, and sometimes insights that come from non-rational sides of your brain. And it also has a dimension a lot of people don't recognize, which is you can never actually prove anything true in the strict sense, philosophical sense. You have to, you just say all swans are white. No number of white swans will ever prove that statement true. But one non-white swan, like the black swans of Australia, will prove it false. And this is something the philosopher of science called Popper back in the 30s pointed out. Science is about putting out a conjecture, hypothesis, and then try to shoot it down, not to prove it right. And so that's how science works. If you can't falsify it, if you can't shoot down a hypothesis, then you're not doing science. And that really rules out not just religion, but any other dogmas like Marxism and so on, which refuse to have any kind of contradiction or any kind of falsification. So long as they do that, they're not doing the scientific method. So the scientific method is different than what people think it is. And then there's the reason that people mostly trust science, of course, is that it works, right? Science is the reason that most people, at least in developed countries, don't die in childbirth. You can all thank science for being here to listen to this program right now. Science is the reason we have the technology we're using right now to make this program, right? We take this for granted, but we wouldn't have it, didn't even have it a decade ago in some cases. It's scientific advances and engineering advances that make those things happen. And the major aspect of science, especially that the public doesn't realize, is science is self-policing. Science is self-criticizing, self-checking. It's the only, pretty much the only area of human endeavor anymore where it's possible to have basic fact checking and peer review. And the peer review, especially the public doesn't understand. Peer review is when you have a scientific idea, and you write it up as a paper, submit it to a journal. The journal will then submit it to at least 2 and usually more reviewers who are experts in your field. And it's usually done anonymously. So those reviewers can be total, enemies of yours. They can be people who hate you passionately, disagree with everything you do, and you have to deal with that. Okay, they can give you a really nasty review, and if you think your ideas are good, you can fight back, and the editor has to act as a referee. But the point being that paper is never published in a scientific journal unless it's gone through peer review, which weeds out 90% of the garbage. Okay, there are still a few bad papers to get through once in a while, but it doesn't happen that often. And that's the only place left in society now where we have fact checking and quality control and what it is said, peer review. So things that science generally tend to be true because they've been carefully scrutinized. And to contrast that with everything you find, for example, especially in the internet now, I call the internet the cesspool of lies, right? It's just 90% websites with factual misinformation or just plain out lies. And you can have a dozen websites about cryptozoology and Bigfoot, and nobody even has a website really debunking that, although I wrote a book about it. It's that kind of thing. The stuff that's on the internet is mostly whatever's popular, and whatever's popular tends to be false.
And science, like you said, is self-correcting. Science is willing to admit that it can be wrong,
right.
and it's
That's
set
right.
up to correct itself. Unlike almost everything else out there, especially the churches. I mean, the churches can't admit they're wrong because it's the Word of God, right?
It's
and
dogma,
how
yeah.
can God possibly
any
be
dogma
wrong?
is not correctable. That's right.
It's not correctable.
And so this is a standard problem. We have a society where we go on going with all these ideas that are either false or just misguided. And but science is the only one that gives us answers, which we can test, which we can do it. And of course, the real acid test is it works. We have a society entirely dependent on science now, although people don't think about it very much that way. And Carl Sagan had a famous quote, which I'll paraphrase here. He said, "The tragedy is we have a society almost entirely based on science and technology, but we have a population that doesn't understand it."
Exactly true. And the other thing is that we use science to prove things that actually exist. And they say, well,
right.
Science can't prove that science can't prove that God exists because it's not up to us to prove something. If somebody says this is red, they have to prove that it's red. If somebody says God exists, they have to prove it. It's not up
right.
to prove that it doesn't exist. You can't prove a negative.
Right.
And if you have something that there's no way to prove it, you know what? It doesn't exist.
Right. Yeah. The issue is burden of proof, right? When Darwin, for example, first published his book in 1859, the burden of proof was on him to establish that evolution had occurred. And now here we are more than 150 years later, and the evidence is overwhelming. So the burden of proof rises on people who want to disagree with evolution. They have to overwhelmingly shoot down all the evidence that's accumulated in 150 years. And so this is the issue we have to deal with here. We are obligated to prove that God exists. That's a claim somebody else is making, and they have to prove it to us, to our satisfaction. So we are not under any obligation to try to do that job.
Absolutely correct. And all these people who are trying to sit there and deny evolution are just they don't have any. We have the proof that evolution has occurred. We have the proof that it occurs through natural selection, and they have absolutely nothing out there to invalidate that. And yet they have. They can take tax deductions from their money. They can get people donating money to them in order to prove something that is absolutely fallacious and wrong. It's incredible.
Yeah, it doesn't really have much to do with science or evidence at all.
Nothing to do with science.
I mean, if you belong to a fundamentalist creationist church, right, you're a biblical literalist, and pretty much part and parcel of the job is that if you believe in the literal Bible, and if you don't, if your beliefs are that if you don't believe it literally, you go to hell, of course, there's no choice, right? You're not going to listen to science. You're not going to listen to evidence. You're just worried about going to hell. And so that really is much more powerful, which is why you can't argue with them. And you can't really even debate them because they're not even interested in science. They're not going to play by the rules of science. They're just worried about your salvation and theirs, of course. And going to hell is the thing that scares them the most. So you're never going to win. That's too powerful an incentive.
And it's amazing to me how they will accept science and use science in their daily life, right, and then deny it. I remember when I used to live in Oregon. These people who believe that they can pray for health and to get well, and I get for the name just escapes out of mind. What are those people called who believe that they can pray?
Oh, about the holy rollers, the ones who are faith healers.
Yeah, faith healers. So you pray to God, and there was this case that came out where this child had died because of a bowel obstruction, and they prayed to God to save this child's life. A bowel obstruction is a relatively easy thing for a doctor to take care of, but the child died because of it. And the newspapers went and talked to him, and there he was saying, "Oh yes, God will do this, and we'll pray and this kind of stuff." Except what was interesting, he was wearing glasses. He was wearing glasses. So why didn't he pray to God to fix his eyesight so he doesn't need glasses? Right. So this is just unbelievable. But I want to talk about one other thing that is one of the people don't realize that Darwinism, evolution, descent from natural selection is the basis of biology. It is the absolute foundation, and everything that comes out of it, whether it's medicine or healthcare or all this kind of stuff, it's all based on Darwinian evolution. And so these people who reject it, they're rejecting the very thing that brought them the medicine that helps keep them alive, that helps keep them healthy and makes it better.
Yeah, and in fact, they're the very things that they have to deal with, like viral infections and bacterial infections. The reason they're constantly a challenge and they're constantly infecting us, and there's a new strain of flu every year and new strains of cold all the year because they're evolving too fast. Right? They change their protein coats. So they're no longer recognizable to our immune system, and they've evolved in less than 6 months or a year, and they're a brand new strain that we have to deal with every cycle. I likewise, in these parts of the country that are very fundamentalist, their agriculture is always being threatened by pests. And so then they throw DDT, and then they throw something else, and they throw pyrethrin, and they keep getting all these pesticide-resistant bugs, insects that have been bombarded with every kind of pest, and of course, are submitted to a very harsh form of selection, which means the bugs that can survive these things become the survivors. And now we have these bugs, these insects that infest their crops that have evolved because of fundamentalists using pesticides. So these things are happening right around them in real time and in our own bodies every year, and yet they deny its existence.
Yeah, that's what's so amazing, that we're in the 20th century and we still have these folks suggesting everything from the earth is flat to anti-vaxxers and climate change deniers. Could you kind of comment on this anti-science vogue memes that seem to be spreading and growing everywhere?
Yeah, it's a combination of factors, I think. One factor, and one I talk about in the talk you heard in Riverside a month ago, is that, in the 90s, it was very hard for crazy ideas like flat earthism or things like that to have very much traction. These people who were fervent believers in flat earthism would send out a bunch of hand-mailed, hand-typed flyers or whatever, and they reached a limited number of people, and they were scattered in various places around the globe, not very many large numbers. The internet changed all that. now all it takes is a few clicks, and if you start clicking on one, say, flat Earth site, it'll immediately send you down the rabbit hole of one after another after another. And if you don't know any better, you're sucked into it before you know it. You're believing what you see. The giant cesspool lies is very, very powerful because all it requires is that you click and click and click, and the longer you watch, the happier Bill Gates and all these other guys and Mark Zuckerberg and all the rest are, because that's what makes money for them as long as you're engaging in it. And so the whole system is set up to keep you clicking and keep you watching. And this is, of course, counterproductive when it does things like makes you fall into the rabbit hole of crazy shit like flat earthism. That's part of it. Another part of it is change in political winds. Creationism was pretty much on its back in the 50s and 60s, in an age when science was in its strongest, and tried so darndest to make dents on society over the 70s and 80s. But certainly since the late part of the 80s and 90s, when fundamentalism sort of allied itself with the GOP, and this is partly Reagan's doing, of course, they became essentially the shock troops of the Republican Party. And they're also the largest single core group that now becomes loyally Republican. And their goals are non-negotiable, right? They're for pushing against gays, pushing against abortion, pushing against a lot of other things. And evolution, of course, is sort of in the background of that, along with climate change denial. And so these things were sort of minority positions not that long ago, but now an entire party identifies with these various anti-science positions, especially climate denial, because the funders of a lot of the GOP, of course, are the big oil companies and energy companies. They pay a lot of bills and take care of a lot of politicians, and so these politicians are loaded in their pockets. So the GOP has become, in many ways, a party of anti-science. It's anti-evolution, anti-climate change. Many of them are anti-vax as well. That pretty much crosses all spectra to some degree. But they were the big ones who, it was almost all Republicans who were anti-COVID vaccine and denied COVID even existed in some cases. And of course, to their own detriment, many of them died because of it. So science now can be deadly at times. COVID was a good example of that. Yeah. So it's become political as well. It's pretty much a litmus test in the modern GOP. If you're really running for a political office as a Republican, you have to be anti-vaxxer, you have to be anti-climate, you have to be anti-evolution. And so we're not even in a position anymore where these topics are being discussed in a rational way. It's all about, identity politics.
And part of the problem is in the news media, if they've got this thing of equivalency. If you
right.
say A, you also have to say B. And we have things like having in school where if they teach evolution, you have to teach intelligent design, which is nonsense, absolute nonsense. Intelligent design doesn't exist. Evolution exists, and yet they pass laws saying that you have to teach nonsense, intelligent design.
Yeah. Well, it's because they've been struck down in the courts over and over again. Originally, it was just straight creationism, and then they called themselves scientific creationists, and all they did was take the word to name God out of the Bible, but otherwise it was the same thing. And then intelligent design came along in the 90s as a way to even sneak away their religious motivations even further and claim they weren't religiously motivated. But in 2005, the federal court showed that was, in fact, a lie. So the intelligent design has pretty much been on decline in a real sense in 2005. They have not won any more court victories or really influenced too many more textbooks.
Well, I'm afraid
the fundamentalism are still going on. And, of course, their strategy just gets more subtle. So, if you pay attention to NCSC's website, I get their emails all the time. They just put in more and more of these very subtle laws, which they have to be fair to teaching any point of view or this or that way. And they're not telling you at fracked out that they're trying to push away to teach creationism, but that's the motivation.
Well,
so this kind of thing is, the false equivalence. We don't in public schools teach the earth is flat because it's a lie. And yet there are people who would argue that if we can teach creationism as evolution, we should teach the earth is flat and the stars are in the big dome above us, and astrology is the same thing as astronomy and so on. So
well, I am concerned about this. This courts have ruled that you can't teach intelligent design. I'm concerned with this new Supreme Court that we have with this crazy Christian majority that's on there, that they will rule that, oh, well, yes, of course school's going to teach intelligent design. We have to be fair.
That's something I worry about all the time ever since that three conservative judges were put up by Trump and by McConnell. They mostly been tackling social policy issues, and of course the Dobbs decision is the one that's become a political lightning rod. But any time now we can expect somebody to try to bring a creationism case, and these guys will decide it's constitutional to teach religion. They already do not believe in the separation of church and state, and they've said it in so many words, especially Alito, and of course before him some of the judges that preceded him. So there's a very good chance that might come up in front of them at some point in the near future.
I'm sure it's going to come up. These crazy people, they're not crazy. They're not stupid. They're just, I don't know, were they misguided? They've been brainwashed. One of the things that's always got me is that they're talking about, groomers, the gay people out grooming children. Gay people have nothing on the church. The church grabs the kids when they're little babies and starts grooming them for religion from the get-go. They're the real groomers, and they're the ones that are the children are really endangered. Richard Dawkins talked about in his books, The God Delusion, how children are said, oh, this is a Muslim child, this is a Catholic child. You wouldn't say this is a physical economist child. You don't expect them to know that kind of stuff, but somehow we expect children are supposed to know Catholic theology and Muslim theology and Hindu theology. This is nonsense. We brainwash children, we groom children to sit so when they get older, they've been brainwashed since they were 6 months old to believe in God. So it's very hard to get it out of your head, even when you see the facts right in front of you, because you've been imprinted with it.
And the other aspect, of course, is if you still belong to the same culture you were raised in, the social pressures are very strong to stay with your group and to not be the black sheep. And so even if you find some personal doubts about whether you're Christian or Muslim or whatever, you don't have the option in most cases of really to not believing, because your family, your friends, everyone around you in your community, especially in a small community, all believe as well. And if you don't, you're not going to fit in. Common question you get if you meet somebody in the Midwest, and I lived in the Midwest for a while in my life, after they inquire about your name, they say, oh, what church do you go to?
Yeah.
That's assumed if you live in a small town in the Midwest that you belong to one of the churches in town.
I know atheists who have no belief in supernatural forces, but they're afraid to tell their families. Yeah. It's the same That's thing. It's the same thing like when gay people, when they're teens and they're afraid to tell their family because they're going to get kicked out of their homes. Well, these wonderful Christian loving people will kick an atheist out of the home too, and out of their communities. And so it's absolutely insanity, and it's not getting better. And that's what's so surprising me. Here we are in the 21st century, where everything in our lives is based on science. From the minute we get up, 24 hours a day, science is helping us keep asleep on a comfortable bed and this kind of stuff. And people still want to, debunk it. And this is very dangerous. Science denialism can cause us major problems, and it can cause laws to be passed, and even the government agencies. How does science denialism affect laws, and how does it affect government agencies that are making regulations and so on?
Well, most of the time it hasn't had too much effect, because federal agencies, luckily, are much more respective of the border of church and state, for example, than, let's say, many other institutions. But, every once in a while you read about some crazy person who's gotten such and such a thing published in a journal that it goes into regulating science. But most of the time, for example, the FDA and the major government agencies are pretty much all based on, medicine and doctors and legitimate scientists who pretty much make sure policies stay in touch with real science. And there are exceptions. I mean, at one time we had a president who was asking us to inject bleach and do other things to ourselves.
We may have him again as a president. Very frightening.
That was the worst possible message we could give any people at that particular time. But of course, that's what our president believed, or at least he thought he was thinking at the time. So, there are exceptions. But generally speaking, government agencies are pretty much nonpartisan and also pretty much non-religious. And they respect the wall between church and state. And they have regulations and bylaws, of course, in their founding documents, which also pretty much enforce that. So you don't see too much of that problem at all in government agencies. As much as you might be worried about it, isn't as big a problem as it is elsewhere, proliferation of religious schools and religious universities, there's where you see a lot more indoctrination happening and a lot of policy changes going on. But it is true, science denialism is dangerous. I mean, the most overt danger it prevents right now is, of course, our lack of action on climate. This is going to be something that our grandkids will curse us for not having done more in this generation. I look at my generation; it's now in its senior years, and think, "Oh my God, we did not know this." But we knew this into the '70s. We knew this. We still haven't acted any real sense on it 50 years later. So it's someday it's going to come to haunt, well, not my children, but probably my grandchildren. Although many of those things are already happening. Okay, we already see signs of climate change across the board, and we just broke all the records for the hottest year on record here in 2023, and it's still happening in early 2024. So it's happening now. It's not something you see overnight. It takes small steps at a time, and you have to watch it over time to really realize how gigantic it is.
I am so disappointed by my generation. I'm the baby boomer generation. I was at the very beginning
so
of it. And we were so environmentally conscious, weren't we? We started the environmental movement. And here we are not doing anything about stopping this climate crisis that is going to engulf the entire planet and make the entire and only people who are going to be okay is going to be the filthy rich who are able to build compounds where they'll be okay, and everybody else is going to be. I mean, this is not. I'm going to be dead by 2050. But
that's the irony. In the 1970s, it was not even possible to be a politician in the pockets of big oil. The EPA, the Clean Air Act, all those things are passed with gigantic majorities. I mean, almost unanimously in both houses of Congress by both Republican and Democratic Congresspeople. And President Nixon signed the EPA law into act. So he was a Republican, but then Republicans were also pro-environment in those days. And it happened because the environmental movement was in its strongest position at that point. And so everybody was favorable to the environment, and nobody was going to defend the oil companies or the other people who destroy the planet. But over the years, of course, that position eroded, and the oil companies began to use their immense power and wealth to buy politicians and to influence policy. And we know for a fact they did a tremendous amount of misinformation campaigns to fund front agencies like the Heartland Institute to deny climate change. At the same time, their own scientists were telling them that they were causing climate change, but that they were always only protecting their own bottom lines. And so they had all these millions of dollars spent on publicity to deny climate change and slow down climate change denial, or slow down climate change policy, and do everything they could to undermine it. And we're all going to look back in those days and say, curse oil companies for what they did to us, because ironically, we're going to need to get out of oil anyway. Within a couple of decades, most countries in the world will not be using much of any oil. It'll also be very, very scarce because we're close to the limits of oil anyway on this planet. And so we won't be able to use it as cheaply as we do now to begin with. So the oil age is coming to an end for a lot of reasons, and it should have come to an end sooner if we had listened to the scientists back in the 70s.
Well, they took their cue from the tobacco companies that used to lie about how the danger. The tobacco companies knew that tobacco causes cancer, but they lied about it. They lied about it, and we finally were able to overcome them. But I don't know if it ever
took the RICO Act for the mafia to get the tobacco executives to force themselves to be on the floor of Congress and actually basically perjure themselves and claim they didn't know all the stuff that their own research had told them was true.
Yeah,
so,
I have a quote here from Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is one of my absolute favorite people in the whole world.
A friend of mine. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, you know him.
Yeah.
I wish I did. He said that the good thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe in it. And that is really kind of the bottom thing here. So what is going on that these otherwise sensible people to deny the findings of science when they live it? They live it in their only day. So question is, how can a person recognize science denialism? Is it always very isolated, or is it sometimes
about
hidden?
Neil's quote, I mean, basically, we take it for granted is what's happened. We do not think about how science has saved most of us from dying in childbirth, And science has kept us alive whenever dangerous medical issues happen. And we don't think about how, here we are, we're living in technology that keeps getting better every year. We don't, it really doesn't make a dent on our thinking that science is responsible for that. We don't thank science enough, right? And so that is the fundamental root. We just to take it for granted it's always going to be advances in science and technology. But of course, it wouldn't be there if we didn't have the people willing to do that work, to make the discoveries and do the research and write the grant proposals. It's very laborious, hard work, and a lot of it never pays off. But when it does pay off, it's paid off spectacularly. And of course, it's the only reason our society is advanced as it is. We just have to look back to, let's say, the early part of the 20th century, how far we have come, right? The fastest you could travel in 1903 before the airplane was invented was with a horse or a train. And now we can travel around the Earth, and of course, astronauts circle the Earth in a matter of hours. And all these monstrous transformations in our society we just take for granted, but they're all relatively recent, barely a century or so since we've had most of them.
Science is relatively new. It's only like, what, 200 or 300 years old, really. And
Yeah, depending on what you call science. Yeah, I mean, certainly things like the discovery of heliocentrism and so on are about 400 or 500 years old. But you could say beginning with Isaac Newton or the Enlightenment in the 1700s, that would be pretty much when science begins to happen. And it really isn't until the late 19th, 20th century that it really takes off and becomes the dominant force it is now.
Isn't the scientific method really only about 200 or 300 years old?
Yeah, you would see people using the scientific method probably about 200 years ago. And I mean, Galileo and Copernicus, of course, used probably the basic scientific method when they rejected the geocentric Earth and recognized it didn't fit the data, and so they subconsciously were doing that type of thing as well.
Very true. Very, very true. So, what can people do to counter the science denialism that seems to be growing, not shrinking?
Well, it starts with taking care of your own self, which means watching out to not get sucked into bad websites and bullshit on the web, and paying attention to where you learn things and checking stuff before you forward it on Facebook, to make sure it's scientifically valid. And we have to use our critical thinking skills. That's number one for our own benefits, especially when it comes to anything that concerns your life. So if you're going to do a medical procedure or going to do something, make a decision that's based on scientific evidence, you can look it up and find it in reputable websites and books and all the rest, and look it up and figure it out. That's job number one, just to make sure your own world is taken care of and that of your people around you, your loved ones, and all the rest. Beyond that, the best thing I can think of is just to make it part of your political life, right? The only way to get rid of science denial is to gradually deny it power. And so, you have to vote against people who are science denialists, which today are all Republicans, or Robert Kennedy Jr. It's hard to tell what he is. But, getting rid of science denialism is getting rid of their power sources. Now, they're not, the fundamentalist churches aren't going to vanish right away, although they are shrinking. And we non-religious types are the second largest group on the country now, except for Roman Catholics. So we are becoming more influential, and that's another story. But in the meanwhile, do all you can to counteract the effects of religious groups running the politics, the religious groups overcoming, say, town councils and so on, wherever it comes to an issue like evolution or climate change, wherever you can't fight their battle in their turf, but if they try to intrude on the public sphere, that's when you act. So I've been very active, for example, in the battle over creationism, because I'm qualified to do that as a paleontologist, but I've also been active in writing books about climate change, which is my latest book, by the way, because I'm also trained in climate science. So I feel qualified to do that, and I teach about it at college level. So those are the kinds of things I would value as the most useful way to spend time doing it. I mean, there are some people who enjoy debating creationists online. Believe me, I have done that. I don't do it anymore. It's just a giant waste of time because you're not going to change anyone's mind unless you enjoy that kind of type of flame wars. It's not worth it. But making sure the fear is taken care of, that people are voted out of office if they're threatening the scientific health of the country, whether it's climate change denial or evolution or whatever. Those are the kind of things that make the biggest difference.
And you are so right. It's got to be political. We have got to get out there, and we need to support the organizations that are working for us, whether it's a Center for Inquiry or it's American Atheists or Americans United for
The
Separation.
NCSE, National Science Center for Science Education, is the one that does the biggest job of fighting creationism and climate denial. And they're a tiny little nonprofit run out of Oakland. But
What's the name of the
they're
organization
always on the
again?
front lines. Whenever creationism or whatever shows up in school districts or in state legislatures, they're the ones who supply the resources and the staffing and everything to help these people fight back. And
What is
so
the
I'm a
name?
very big
What
supporter
is the
of
name
theirs.
of that organization again?
NCSC, National Center for Science Education. And you can just look up NCSC on the line. You'll find their website. They are based out of Oakland, but they're a nonprofit whose main job has been, originally was to support teaching of evolution and to fight creationism, but they've broadened their mandate now, so they also fight climate denial as well. I've been a member of it since it was actually before it was founded. I was a member of their predecessor called the Committee of Correspondence back when I taught in Illinois. And then they've evolved into NCSE at a later time, and I've always been happy to support them. And of course, they gave me that award a few years ago, which was nice. But anyway, they're really the most effective because they're small, but they are very well prepared, and they're very effective at reaching, especially high school teachers, the people who are really on the real front lines of science issues, like people in high school science classes. They're the ones who come in and help them out. If there's some creationist school board member trying to change the curriculum, they're the ones who come in and supply the resources so that teachers and school officials who don't want science nihilism getting into the school district can fight back.
National Center for Science Education. Take a look
That's
up
right.
on the internet and join them and give them some support. Doctor, I want to thank you so much for taking your time to join us on here. Do you give out any kind of contact information if somebody wants to contact you, or do you keep
can
it hidden?
find my website, although I got to update it pretty soon. But I would recommend, if I could do a little bit of a plug here, I actually wrote a whole book on science nihilism, which I'll hold up for those who have the video feed, called Reality Check, published by Indiana University Press a few years ago, written before Trump, so a lot has changed, but it is basically covers the same issues and how science nihilism has become politicized, which of course has come more so since I wrote that book. I was prophetic, and I'm not happy that I was right. But anyway, that's a book that I published on that topic, and then I have a new book called on the climate denial called The Story of Climate and 25 Discoveries. It actually talks about climate going back to the origin of the Earth, but then it works into modern climate change at the end. So that's my latest book. It just came out last month.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show. I am extremely proud. We'll have to have you back again on sometime in the near future. Thank you, Doctor.
Yeah, I talk a lot about other topics, evolution, other topics as well. If you feel like it, just let me know.
You got it. Good night. Thank you.
Thanks, Lanny. Appreciate it.
We appreciate you, Doctor. Okay, we're running out of time, but this has been a fantastic show. I have just loved this one. I hope you've loved it too. Don't forget, check out that National Center for Science Education and also the California Free Thought Day. Check them out as well. Hey, next Tuesday, April 23rd at 8 p.m., we're going to be featuring the Reverend Terry Turner. Here we are putting them down, but he's a longtime sojourner on the spiritual path. He holds a THB in Christian theology and an MA in consciousness studies. But here is what is so incredible. He is the first graduate of the psilocybin facilitator training in Oregon and will begin practicing this spring. That's right. Oregon has legalized psilocybin, and we're going to have one of the first licensed facilitators on our show next week. He's going to talk about how psilocybin works. He's going to talk about why it works, and he's going to talk about how you can take advantage of this new program in Oregon. You don't have to be an Oregon resident. So tune in next Tuesday at 8 p.m. when everything you've always wanted to know about psilocybin but were afraid to ask, it's going to be on this show. Hey, thank you for joining us. Please let your friends, your family, and that strange guy down the street know about Lanny Sense. Heard every Tuesday at 8 p.m. on KCA Radio, the station that leaves no listener behind.